The subcommittee will come to order without objection. The chair will be authorized to declare recesses during votes in the House. I'll yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today's hearing will examine the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, and the domestic terrorism threats posed by these terrorists. Although ISIL seems to have reared its head only in the last 18 months, a closer look quickly reveals ISIL to be an old foe, one with whom the United States has done battle for more than a decade. Before the group declared itself a global caliphate and adopted its current name, it was merely the Islamic State of Iraq. During the Iraq War, members of this same group were among the most prolific perpetrators of attacks on American troops and our partners in Iraq. The procession of name changes, however, has made no difference in ISIL's commitment to harm Americans. Earlier this month, we were all reminded of this when we learned of Kayla Mueller's death after 18 months of ISIL captivity. The 26-year-old from Prescott, Arizona, traveled to Syria with Doctors Without Borders to help alleviate the suffering wrought there by Islamic extremism. Distance does not make us in the United States immune from ISIL's destructive ideology. From far beyond the battlefields of Syria and Iraq comes funding and support for this group's call to arms against the West. And the domestic threat is not limited to New York City and our nation's capital. 2 weeks ago in St. Louis, 5 Bosnians were charged with providing material support to ISIL. The suspects allegedly provided weapons, military uniforms, and equipment, and money to a 6th Bosnian who left the United States in 2013 to join ISIL in Syria. Alarmingly, all 6 individuals are natives of Bosnia who immigrated to the United States. 3 are now naturalized citizens, and the remaining 3 have either refugee or legal resident status. But the threats posed by ISIL's hateful ideology are not purely external. Inciting Americans to join their ranks or to ally themselves with ISIL's mission is a pivotal component in their campaign of violence against America and its people. Last month, a Cincinnati man named Christopher Lee Cornell was arrested at a gun shop purchasing multiple weapons. He is alleged to have been collecting for an attack here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Cornell became an adherent of radical Islam on the Internet. Having adopted the jihadi worldview, he aimed to gun down members of Congress and government employees for the glory of ISIL, a terrorist group on the other side of the world with whom he had no connection except devotion to the same perverted Islamist ideology. As FBI Director Comey has pointed out, these are not isolated incidents. ISIL's connections are being investigated in virtually every part of the United States. But on the heels of the St. Louis and Cincinnati arrests, and just days after ISIL released a video depicting the beheading of 21 Egyptian Christians in Libya, President Obama convened a summit on countering violent extremism, a summit that failed to include FBI Director James Comey and refused to acknowledge that ISIL and other terrorist organizations are motivated by radical Islam. As one commentator noted, this summit was strangely sympathetic to Islamic sensibilities and grievances at the very time when rampaging jihadists, while quoting Islamic scripture, are barbarically slaughtering their enemies and conducting a pogrom against Christians. The President's unwillingness to acknowledge the true motives of these terrorists not only emboldens their campaigns of terror and makes Americans less safe. Meanwhile, ISIL continues its march across western Iraq and continues to strew its propaganda of hatred and murder across the globe. Yesterday, 3 New York City residents, 2 from Uzbekistan and 1 from Kazakhstan, were arrested for plotting to travel to Syria to join ISIL and, quote, wage jihad. According to the criminal complaint, one of these men stated he would kill President Obama if he had the opportunity to do so. The witnesses today will hopefully shed light on the escalating domestic terror threat posed by ISIL and those who would ally themselves with Islamic extremism. It is now my pleasure to recognize for her opening statement a ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Good morning. Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. We are finding so much common ground as we try to include issues of criminal justice reform, but also securing the domestic tranquility of this nation. This hearing is involving ISIL in America, domestic terror, and radicalization. And so it is important to note that this Islamic State is a brutal terrorist organization. It has murdered thousands of civilians, including 4 United States citizens. It threatens to topple regional movements. It has as its stated goal the religious and ethnic cleansing of the areas under its control. But I think it's important to note, as has been said by our Commander-in-Chief, the United States is not at war with Islam, but it is the contorted, disjointed, and ludicrous interpretation of those who simply want to be violent and vile and kill people. And even if it cannot strike the United States homeland directly, as it has been alleged, ISIL clearly hopes to inspire Americans to act against us from within. As evidence, the Chairman has already noted, 3 would-be ISIL actors caught and apprehended by the FBI, of which I thank you so very much. 2 at John F. Kennedy Airport, where millions travel every day, as do millions every day in the United States, grandmothers going to see grandchildren, college students going home, business persons seeking to participate in the capitalistic system of this nation, or people simply going to vacation, maybe even in the nation's capital, the cradle of democracy for this nation. So while I am grateful that the United States is leading a multinational coalition to degrade and ultimately destroy the Islamic State, I am certain that we cannot bomb our way out of this problem. In my view, the domestic threat posed by ISIL and other terrorist organizations must be met on 3 fronts. First, we must engage in real outreach to the communities most at risk for radicalization. By outreach, I do not mean that past practices of certain police departments that deployed undercover agents into mosques and community centers may be the only approach. We know that is the approach that is used when you are investigating. Nor do I mean that the heavy-handed use of informants within certain immigrant communities. These tactics have been misdirected and costly. Countering violent extremism should not ever be the pretext to profile a United States person on the basis of race, religion, or culture. However, we know that intelligence gathering is important. And so I certainly believe that that is a strong element of making sure that those who want to do us harm do not do so. But last week, I had the privilege of attending the White House Summit on Countering Violent Extremism. At that event, President Obama observed terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL deliberately target their propaganda in the hopes of reaching and brainwashing young Muslims, especially those who may be disillusioned or wrestling with their identity. The President is right. ISIL has proven adept at using social media to spread its message. The United States, the New York Times calculates that the group posts 90,000 tweets and social media responses every day. How do we combat this propaganda? By empowering local communities, teachers, faith communities, and police officers alike to talk openly and honestly about what ISIL is, what it threatens to do, and how it twists the basic threats of Islam to serve its own purposes. I'm particularly interested in how we can engage with segments of these communities that often go overlooked, for example, women and young people who are not always invited to participate in the dialogue, but have the power to spread a positive message where police officers and government spokespersons cannot. Second, we must maintain vigilance at our borders. To date, to our knowledge, about 150 United States persons have traveled to Syria or Iraq to fight alongside ISIL, the Nusra Front, and the like. There are known instances of a U.S. person attempting to return from the region after participating in that conflict. The more immediate threat, of course, is the thousands of individuals from our allied nations in Europe, Northern Africa, and Middle East who have traveled to Syria undetected, gained terrorist training or military experience, and may now seek to travel. This is not an idle concern. The National Counterterrorism System estimates that 20,000 individuals from 90 countries have traveled to fight in Syria. Mr. Chairman, I've introduced H.R. 48, the No-Fly for Foreign Fighters Act, which I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record.
Without objection.
Which would require the government to review both terrorist screening database and the terrorist watch list for a complete list with respect to any of these foreign fighters and to report back to Congress with the results within 90 days. Finally, we must fully fund, Mr. Chairman, the Department of Homeland Security without delay. The Islamic State is our focus today, but is only one threat in an increasingly complex landscape. I would hope that we would, again, as I know that the chairman and myself have worked together with members of the Judiciary Committee, that we enter into an effort to protect national security over political security. And I say that to reinforce the final words I want to offer of the Honorable Suzanne E. Spalding, who is the Undersecretary of National Protection and Programs Director of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, just her words in terms of the whole combination of threat and cyber security threats. As a nation, we are faced with pervasive cyber threats. Malicious actors, including those at nation-state level, are motivated by a variety of reasons that include espionage, political and ideological beliefs, and financial gain. Increasingly, state, local, tribal, and territorial networks are experiencing cyber activity of a sophistication level that's seen on federal networks and has probably not been seen before. This hearing is a vital hearing because it squarely places us in the role of fighting terrorism, and I thank the chairman very much, and I thank the witnesses for their presence here today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Does the gentlewoman wish to include the statement that she just referred to in the record?
I'll ask unanimous consent,
Without,
Mr. Chairman.
without objection.
Thank you, gentlemen.
The chair recognizes the chair of the full committee, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte.
Thank you, Chairman Sensenbrenner. With increasing regularity, Americans are being witness to the depravity of terrorists claiming the mantle of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL. Relatively unknown to many in America, just a few years ago, ISIL relishes in their own barbarity with videos depicting shootings, beheadings, and the burning alive of unarmed prisoners. Recently, ISIL claimed to mark the occasion of conquering a small town in western Iraq by burning 45 of its inhabitants at the stake. The group's history gives us little reason to dismiss this as hyperbole, and ISIL's savagery is limited no more by geography than by human decency. Earlier this month in Libya, hundreds of miles from the group's claimed territory, ISIL terrorists rounded up and videotaped themselves decapitating 21 Egyptian Christians who refused to renounce Christ and accept ISIL as their new masters. Americans are not mere observers of ISIL's atrocities. Our people and our homeland are intimate parts of ISIL's plans. The organization's leadership has called for attacks on America and the rest of the West. They have solicited young people to renounce their lives and join them in their perverted war. Unfortunately, even deep in the American heartland, these calls have found some receptive ears. Speaking in Jackson, Mississippi earlier this month, FBI Director James Comey emphasized that even that city is not beyond ISIL's reach. He urged law enforcement and American citizens everywhere to be vigilant and not dismiss the domestic threat from extremism. Just yesterday, Director Comey disclosed that the Bureau is investigating suspected supporters of ISIL in every U.S. state. Director Comey's concerns are borne out by the facts. The last several years have seen 3 distinct threats to the homeland from Levantine terrorism. The first is the recruitment of young Americans into the ISIL fold. In addition to thousands of Europeans, over 150 Americans have been discovered joining in the fighting in the Middle East or attempting to do so. Those who have taken up the ISIL banner fit no social, ethnic, or even gender profile. Douglas MacArthur McCain grew up in Chicago and Minneapolis with a close-knit family. He was a popular joker in high school and a devoted fan of the Chicago Bulls. Last summer, a tattoo of his was used to confirm him as the first American to be killed fighting for the terrorists in Syria. Young women are also being recruited, lured to leave their families and become jihad wives of ISIL fighters. Shannon Conley, a teenager from Arvada, Colorado, was arrested at Denver International Airport last April en route to her arranged marriage with a 32-year-old Tunisian jihadi. She had changed her Facebook status to Slave of Allah and told FBI agents she looked forward to using the skills she learned in the U.S. Army Explorers program to nurse wounded ISIL fighters. If and when these Americans choose to return to the United States from the battlefields of a brutal civil war, it will be difficult to stop them re-entering. It will be even more difficult to know what they are capable of. We know, for example, that last month's Charlie Hebdo shooters had traveled to the Middle East and receive training from jihadi groups. The second threat, perhaps even more dangerous, requires no travel beyond the nearest computer. The Western world has been plagued by a rash of attacks by self-radicalized lone wolf terrorists who have claimed allegiance to ISIL. Last year, Canada suffered 2 serious terrorist attacks by ISIL adherents who had never gotten closer to the group than their internet message boards. One man drove his car into a group of Canadian Forces soldiers. The other murdered a soldier before attempting to storm the Canadian Parliament. In Australia, a man took 18 people hostage at a chocolate shop, killing 2 of them. In Belgium, a man shot dead 4 people at a Jewish museum. All of these terrorists committed their attacks under the banner of ISIL. Finally, we must not forget that the core group of ISIL, half a world away, plots to attack us directly here in the homeland. This last month, ISIL's Central Command reiterated their intention to attack American policemen, soldiers, and members of our intelligence community. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about these threats, how they are evolving domestically, and the challenges our intelligence and law enforcement officials face in thwarting these terrorist threats.
Can I see her bill?
And violent terrorists, and those who pledge allegiance to them here in our homeland. I also hope to hear how Congress and this committee can best ensure that our country is prepared to stop these threats. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes for his opening statement the ranking member and chairman emeritus of the full committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers.
Thank you, Chairman Sensenbrenner. And to all of my colleagues here, particularly those who have made opening statements, I am deeply concerned about the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. ISIL is a grave regional threat operating from Anbar province in western Iraq. It seized territory from Baghdad to Aleppo and continues to press north into Kurdish territory. In more familiar terms, ISIL now controls an area larger than the United Kingdom. Along the way, it's directed horrific violence at thousands of civilians, particularly at ethnic and religious minorities. And ISIL has also executed hostages, including 4 United States citizens, in barbaric and public fashion. So we should not underestimate ISIL's murderous intent, nor its ability to inspire others to do us harm. But we've learned much from the past decade of fighting radical extremists, and it seems important today to apply some of those lessons in our discussion. The first and most simple lesson is don't panic. As of this morning, the Department of Homeland Security is unaware of any specific credible threat to the United States homeland from ISIL. The National Counterterrorism Center confirms that assessment, noting further that any threat to the U.S. homeland from these types of extremists is likely to be limited in scope and in scale. I do not suggest that we in any way ignore ISIL or the suffering it has caused. No way. But I do point out only that the group's ability to strike directly at the United States appears to be limited, and that our reaction to the home front should be measured and appropriate. The rise of the Islamic State is not an excuse for domestic law enforcement to stigmatize American Muslims. It does not legitimize tactics that have isolated and alienated the communities whose help we need most. Nor does the threat of ISIL justify the government's continued use of Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act to conduct mass surveillance on law-abiding citizens. the NASA's telephone metadata program has never disrupted a terrorist plot, does not extend to the new media formats favored by ISIL, and must be brought to an end without delay. We've better tools at our disposal, which leads me to this consideration. Our best hope for countering the threat of radicalization at home is community engagement at the local level. We haven't evidence of a direct threat from ISIL on the U.S. homeland, but as my colleagues have noted, the group has an aggressive social media presence. Their propaganda targets the most isolated elements of our society. We know what works to counter this messaging. Local, state, and federal law enforcement must build partnerships with teachers, clergy, and other community leaders. These efforts must clearly preserve religious exercise and freedom of expression. Once we've established trust and open lines of communication between police and the communities most at risk for radicalization, we win on two fronts. We are better able to identify potential threats before they grow dangerous, and community leaders have enlisted a powerful partner in countering the twisted rhetoric of ISIL and others like it. I believe the witnesses here today will testify to the effectiveness of this basic approach, and I look forward to further discussion with them on the matter. And perhaps most pressing at this late hour, we must fully fund the Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Chairman, I believe it comes down to a question of priorities. We must preserve the capability to track foreign fighters before they attempt to enter the United States. We must keep the United States Air Marshals in the sky, and we must continue to coordinate with our agents on the front lines of Homeland Security, the Transportation Safety Administration, the United States Customs and Border Patrol, and our own partners in state, local, and tribal law enforcement. Some of these functions may continue in the event of a shutdown, but many will not. Most of the department's leadership team will be furloughed. Federal support to state and local initiatives will terminate. None of the officers who must show up to work will necessarily be paid. And so, my colleagues, there was a time when I believed that we could find common ground on a comprehensive immigration reform. I still believe that. If Speaker Boehner would allow the measure to come to the floor, the bill that has sat on his desk for more than 500 days would receive majority support in the House. But even if we must disagree for now on the urgency of immigration reform, surely we can agree that we must not compromise our national security in a futile effort to score political points against the president. Whatever you think of the underlying policy, a decision to defund the Department of Homeland Security simply will not result in the president's reversing his actions on immigration. I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that the threat posed by ISIL to the homeland is real. I hope that our conversation today will convince my colleagues to prioritize our security over an unrelated political spat and fully fund DHS, Department of Homeland Security, without delay. I too join in welcoming our witnesses. I thank the chairman and yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired long ago. Without objection, other members' opening statements will be made a part of the record. Today we have a very distinguished panel of witnesses. I will begin by swearing in our witnesses before introducing them. If you would, please rise. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony that you are about to give to this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that all of the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Charlotte Police Chief Rodney Monroe is unable to be here today due to the weather, and his written testimony will be entered into the record without objection. Michael B. Steinbach is the Assistant Director of the Counterterrorism Division. Mr. Steinbach began at the FBI in the Chicago Division. He has served as head of the Violent Crimes Task Force at the FBI's Washington Field Office, the Assistant Section Chief for the International Terrorism Operations Section of the Counterterrorism Division, and is Deputy Director for Law Enforcement Services at the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. He was then appointed as Special Assistant to the Associate Deputy Director at FBI Headquarters. Mr. Steinbach has also served as the Special Agent in charge of the FBI's Jacksonville Division, and later as the Special Agent in charge of the Miami Division. Sorry you're coming to the snowy parts and you're at the end of your career. Mr. Steinbach has earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Aerospace Engineering from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1988, after which he served as a naval aviator in the U.S. Navy. Richard W. Stanek, who is familiar as I am with weather like this, is the Sheriff of Hennepin County, Minnesota. In this role, he created a new crime-fighting units at the Sheriff's Office to serve law enforcement agencies and communities countywide. Sheriff Stanek began his career in the Minneapolis Police Department. He rose through the ranks from patrol officer to commander of criminal investigations. While a police officer, he was elected 5 times to the Minnesota legislature, where he authored the state's DWI felony law. In 2003, the governor appointed him Commissioner of Public Safety and Director of Homeland Security for Minnesota. Sheriff Stanek earned a criminal justice degree from the University of Minnesota and a master's degree in public administration from Hamline University. You are all familiar with the green, yellow, and red lights in front of you. I would ask that you limit your testimony to a 5-minute summary, after which the committee members will ask questions under the 5-minute rule. Mr. Steinbach, you are first.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Chairman Sensenbrenner, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the committee. It's also good to see Ranking Member Conyers present, and I appreciate Chairman Goodlatte's opening remarks. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the dynamic threat of foreign fighters traveling in support of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, commonly known as ISIL, and the continued threat to the United States posed by homegrown violent extremists. These threats remain one of the biggest priorities for the FBI, the intelligence community, and our foreign, state, and local partners. It is a blending of the homegrown violent extremism with the foreign fighter ideology, which is today's latest adaptation of the threat. I am pleased to be here today with a strong state and local partner, Hennepin County Sheriff Richard Stanek. Conflicts in Syria and Iraq are currently the most attractive overseas threats for Western-based extremists who want to engage in violence. We estimate upwards of 150 Americans have traveled or attempted to travel to Syria. While this number is small in comparison to the number of European travelers, we must also consider the influence groups like ISIL have on individuals located in the United States who are inspired to commit acts of violence. It is this influence which I refer to as the blended threat. ISIL has proven ruthless in its violent campaign to rule and has become yet the latest terror group attracting like-minded Western extremists. Yet from a homeland perspective, it is ISIL's widespread reach through the internet and social media which is the most concerning, as ISIL has proven dangerously competent, like no other group before it, at employing such tools for its nefarious strategy. ISIL utilizes high-quality traditional media platforms as well as a multitude of most social media campaigns to propagate its extremist ideas. Like al-Qaeda and other foreign terrorist organizations, ISIL has effectively used the internet to communicate, to both radicalize and recruit. Unlike other groups, ISIL has gone one step further and demonstrates an effectiveness to spot and assess potential recruits. Social media, in particular, has provided ISIL with a technical platform for widespread recruitment, operational direction, and consequently has helped bridge the gap between foreign fighters and homegrown violent extremists. As a communication tool, the Internet remains a critical node for terror groups to exploit. One recent example occurred just a few weeks ago. A group of 5 individuals was arrested for knowingly and willingly conspiring and attempting to provide material support and resources to a designated foreign terrorist organization active in Syria and Iraq. Much of their conspiracy occurred on the Internet. Following on other groups' doctrines, ISIL, too, has advocated for lone wolf attacks. Last month, ISIL released a video via social media reiterating the group's encouragement of lone offender attacks in Western countries, specifically advocating for attacks against soldiers and law enforcement and intelligence members. Several incidents have occurred in the United States and Europe over the past few months that indicate this call to arms has resonated amongst ISIL supporters and sympathizers. In one case, an Ohio-based man was arrested in January after he obtained a weapon and stated his intent to conduct an attack on the U.S. Capitol here in Washington, D.C. Using a Twitter account, the individual posted statements, videos, and other content indicating support for ISIL, and he planned his attack based on this voiced support. Likewise, recent events in Australia, Canada, France, and the UK reflect the power of this radicalized message and reemphasize our need to remain vigilant in the homeland, since these small-scale attacks are just as feasible within the United States. We should also understand community and world events as viewed through the eyes of the committed individual may trigger action, as we've seen with the highly publicized events of the attack on military personnel at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Canada and the hostage situation at the cafe in Australia. These acts of terror will attract international attention and may inspire copycat attacks. ISIL is not the only high-profile terrorist organization of concern, however. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, poses an ongoing threat to the homeland and U.S. interests abroad. AQAP's online English magazine, Inspire, advocates for lone wolf attacks to conduct attacks against the homeland and Western targets by utilizing simple and inexpensive tactics and methods. Lastly, social media has allowed groups such as ISIL to use the Internet even more effectively by spotting and assessing potential recruits. With the widespread horizontal distribution of social media, terrorists can identify sympathetic individuals of all ages in the United States, spot, assess, recruit, and radicalize, either to travel or to conduct a homeland attack. The foreign terrorist now has direct access into the United States like never before. As a result, it is imperative that the FBI and all law enforcement organizations understand the latest communication tools and are equipped to identify and prevent terror attacks in the homeland. We live in a technologically driven society, and just as private industry has adapted to these modern forms of communication, so too have the terrorists. Unfortunately, changing forms of communication on the Internet and through social media are quickly outpacing the laws and the technology designed to allow for lawful intercept of communication content. This real and growing gap the FBI refers to as going dark cannot be ignored. We must continue to build partnerships and work with Internet providers and social media companies to ensure lawful, appropriate collection when possible. Most companies are not required by statute to develop lawful intercept capabilities for law enforcement. As a result, services are not developed and deployed. As a result, services are developed and deployed without any ability to lawfully intercept and collect. The FBI, with our federal, state, and local partners, is utilizing all investigative techniques and methods to combat the threat radicalized individuals may pose to the United States. In coordination with our domestic and foreign partners, we are rigorously collecting and analyzing intelligence information as it pertains to the ongoing threat posed by ISIL, AQAP, and other foreign terrorist organizations. I'll end my comments here and put the rest on the record.
Without objection. Sheriff Stanek. Could you please turn your mic on, Sheriff? And we'll reset the clock.
Well, thank you, Chairman Sensenbrenner and Congresswoman Jackson Lee, for your generous invitation to testify here this morning about our community engagement efforts in the Twin Cities, and in particular, our outreach efforts to the Somali diaspora community. I'm Sheriff Rich Stanek from Hennepin County, Minneapolis, Minnesota, a very diverse county with 1.2 million residents. 425,000 of those residents are non-Caucasian. We have 40,000 Oromo, 35,000 Liberians, and nearly 100,000 Somali residents living in Hennepin County, the largest Somali population in the nation. I have 32 years of policing experience, and I currently serve on the National Sheriff's and Major County Sheriff's Association executive boards representing our nation's sheriffs. Mr. Chair, members, just last week I joined our United States Attorney Andy Lugar and other community leaders from Minnesota to participate in the White House Summit on Countering Violent Extremism. We learned firsthand in late 2008 about the reality of radicalization when we had dozens of young men radicalized by al-Shabaab and leave the Twin Cities to fight in Somalia. Several have been confirmed killed fighting for al-Shabaab, including the first confirmed suicide bomber from the United States, Shirwa Ahmed. And Mr. Chairman, as one of the committee members pointed out this morning, we also had Douglas MacArthur McCain, the first American killed in Syria, fighting with ISIL. Most of these young men had never seen Somalia or Syria. They only knew of their American lives. Their parents were shocked that their sons would return to the place that they had so desperately fled. The threat of radicalization from designated terrorist organizations like al-Shabaab or ISIL has become even more invasive. YouTube videos and chat rooms, Facebook pages with links to increasingly violent, radical online programs, training, and ideology. And these threats are real. Just this week, al-Shabaab released another propaganda video on YouTube mentioning the Mall of America in Bloomington, Minnesota, one of the largest cities in my county, encouraging al-Shabaab followers to act out. Now, Mr. Chairman, members, this is a marked change in the message from recruiting people to train overseas to recruiting Americans to train and act out here in the homeland, akin to a lone wolf. In response, we issued a joint media statement and public messaging that included the participation of local, state, and federal law enforcement, as well as the Mall of America Security, a private corporation. We've developed these public-private partnerships that also include the Somali community leaders, educators, and members of the business community, as well as faith leaders, to strengthen the public safety fabric of our community. Our efforts at first were to respond, but now we work to prevent and work to intervene. We help community leaders and family members identify the behaviors that can be cause for concern, such as withdrawal from family and normal social circles, accessing radical religious or jihadist websites, forming close partnerships within a small group of like-minded people, or obtaining large sums of money, conducting fundraising efforts, and acquiring travel documents, amongst others. We are concerned, Mr. Chairman and others, about young people in isolation who cut themselves off from their family and their support networks. So we encourage parents, mothers and fathers, educators, business, and faith leaders to close their own generational and cultural gaps and reach out to at-risk youth. We all share a common mission in protecting our kids and our future. Mr. Chair and members, at first, traditional methods for building communities of trust weren't working. We had language and we had cultural barriers that required new strategies. Translations were difficult at best. Men didn't want women at meetings. Certain groups were in opposition to other groups. The greatest barrier of all, though, Somalis were distrustful of law enforcement because in their home country, law enforcement often operates as the oppressive arm of government. The key to overcoming these barriers was the one-on-one personal relationships between a gentleman named Imam Robley and myself. Imam Robley was introduced and offered his prayer for world peace at the opening of the White House CVE Summit just last week. Others trusted us because he trusted us. He became our sponsor in the community, personally asking members to attend one-day citizen academies tailored to the Somali community. And we let everyone know we'd be working with everyone, the elders, the religious leaders, women, and youth. We hired the first sworn Somali deputy sheriff in Minnesota, Hassan Hussein. We added a Somali community member to our community engagement team, Abdi Muhammad. A great example of our new level of engagement, a Somali woman on our community advisory board assisted us in adopting a new policy on religious head coverings, hijabs, in our jail. For me and law enforcement officers like me across this great country, fulfilling our oath of office means more than respect. We protect the privacy and the civil liberties of all residents in addition to their safety. And for us, this is what it means to serve and protect. Mr. Chair and members, violent extremism is a local threat. Local law enforcement will be the first to respond, and we should be on the front line to educate and strengthen our communities and to prevent or disrupt these threats. Our local law enforcement efforts coincide with the White House National Strategy for Counterterrorism to protect our local communities in ways that are consistent with our values as a nation and as a people. By protecting their civil rights and liberties, we're strengthening our communities and building resiliency. Mr. Chairman, members, we're presenting our American model of self-government and the rule of law, an alternative to the radical message and ideology, a model of freedom and opportunity, education, dignity, and hope. Mr. Chairman, members, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify here this morning.
Well, thank you both for very on-point testimony. And Sheriff, let me say I particularly appreciate your outlining the type of community outreach to basically identify people who might become radicalized by sitting in front of a computer. I think that this is very important, particularly in light of the FBI director's admonition that there are ISIL cells in every state in the country. It is a problem that we face in our local communities, and anyone who thinks that they are immune from the reach of these types of radicals because they live far away from New York or Washington, D.C., I think is deluding themselves. I guess that the best thing that citizens can do is if you see something, say something, and let law enforcement know about it. And the fact that the threat against the Mall of America was not something that was picked up through any kind of classified intelligence information, but the radicals put it right up on the internet, shows how emboldened they are in terms of being able to try to perpetrate giving people who might not be in face-to-face contact with them some very bad ideas on how to harm America and how to harm Americans. You know, I hope that what you've been doing in the Twin Cities is something that can be expanded nationwide where these undercover cells are. So thank you. I don't have any questions of you. I think you've hit all of the bases, but I do have some questions for Mr. Steinbach. We know that several U.S. citizens and U.S. persons have traveled to Syria. They usually go through Turkey. They sneak across the borders. How are you able to track these people? And I guess of greater concern, how are you able to track not only people with U.S. passports, but people with passports from visa waiver countries who have gone to Syria who might be returning or going to the United States?
Sure. So I think it's a complicated answer. There's lots of ways we identify potential travelers: human source, technical means, strong partnerships, particularly with our European partners, state and local level partnerships. It's got to be a multitude of resources applied towards the threat. We don't get that threat right all the time. We don't catch every single one that crosses, that leaves the country. As you know, it's not illegal to depart the United States, so we don't track folks departing the United States. And they've become very smart about going to European destinations to mask their travel. So we have to stay on top of it. So we have to, again, use a multitude of resources, including foreign partners, to stay on top of it.
Do you have the necessary authorities to be able to deal with these people should they attempt to come back to the United States?
Absolutely. If an individual travels over to Syria in support of ISIL, al-Nusra Front, or any foreign terrorist organization, 2339, U.S. 18 2339, material support to terrorism is a good tool to use, and it's an effective tool.
Let me get to people who come from visa waiver countries, which are primarily Western European. Are you able to track whether any of the people who don't need visas an attempt to fly to the United States are able to be caught before they arrive? And if they're not caught before they arrive at the time of the airport, that they are entering into the United States?
So yes and no, sir. So the knowns, and so I think Ranking Member Lee mentioned the numbers and the volume of travelers. That's the volume of travelers going to Syria that we know about. There is an order of magnitude that's unknown to European allies. The known members, the known travelers, they are watch listed appropriately. So whether they're from a visa waiver country or not, they are watch listed appropriately, and we can spot them before they come to the United States. Those unknown individuals that the European allies are not aware of, are not watch listed, that's the problem, and that's where the challenge is.
Okay. Thank you very much. Gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Let me thank both of you for the excellent testimony that you have given and the partnership, though it is not a established partnership, but between local government, sheriff, and the FBI, Ms. Steinbeck, is evident that it is crucial. Let me say to the sheriff and to my colleagues, as Sheriff Stanek mentioned, he was in Washington last week, and I'm particularly grateful that you accepted our invitation to come back this week. So let me go to you first. You made a very important statement that should be reinforced, and I think Mr. Steinbeck, when I question him, will likewise reinforce it. In this country, violent extremism is a local threat, as evidenced by FBI Director Coney as well, about ISIL cells and others. So you are in the eye of the storm. Earlier this week, the terrorist organization Al-Shabaab posted a video declaring that Westgate was just the beginning. Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda affiliate based in Somalia took credit for the 2013 attack on Westgate Shopping Mall in Nairobi. We know how vicious and vile that was and how many lost their lives. The video goes on to mention the Mall of America in Bloomington, Minnesota, which you have spoken of. So I want to pointedly ask you, do we not have a dual responsibility? The threat came right to your doorsteps. And I'd like you to offer either your assessment of the tools that you have, fusion centers, joint terrorism centers, collaboration with that threat coming to your doorstep, even if someone would argue that it is simply a threat with no ability to be implemented. I always believe that caution is the better of the game. But match that with your answer about the outreach, and as that video came out, the potential of the outreach and relationships to get information from the community in which we speak, the Somalian community. Sheriff?
Sure. Well, thank you, Congresswoman Jackson Lee. You're not the first one that asked me that question this week, so I appreciate that. Look, this is what we have said. This propaganda video put out by ISIL mentioning the Mall of America, just that. It's not the first time it's been mentioned. Our resiliency in Minnesota with local law enforcement, my federal law enforcement partners, is very strong. We train, we exercise, we plan and prepare incessantly, hoping that something bad never happens, but knowing full well that each and every day across this country and across this world, it does. But we are prepared. We work through the Joint Terrorism Task Force of the FBI. We work with our private sector partners, like I mentioned, Madam, that the Mall of America is a private security force, but they work hand in hand with the Bloomington Police Department, our Sheriff's Office, our federal law enforcement partners. Our Fusion Center in Minnesota is robust and does a great job day in and day out getting the information out to me as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of my county.
My time is running out. Go to the next part of it, the outreach part, and how that plays a role. And then I have a question for Mr. Steinbeck, so I'm watching the clock, but thank you.
Great. So, I'm sorry, just yesterday afternoon before coming out here, I had lunch with members of the Somali diaspora community. We talked about the Mall of America as well as other things. They renounced what they saw in that video. That would not have happened several years ago. They wouldn't know how to respond. We work with them day in and day out to empower them to understand what's happening in their community with their young men and young women so that these radicalization efforts do not happen. It is about building long-term communities of trust in a respectful partnership that's enduring.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Steinbeck. Let me thank you for your work and thank the FBI for that excellent work in New York just in the last 24 to 48 hours. Very quickly, I'm concerned about the no-fly and let me just say foreign fighters, and we're looking at legislation dealing with making sure our lists are accurate. But frame for us again the extent of the potential foreign fighters coming to the United States, and then comment on any FBI efforts that deals with extremism as it relates to women, which is increasing, as related by the Denver young ladies, who I think the FBI was very much involved in, and certainly an article that I just read about a young woman in Scotland who was a perfect teenager and now has become known as the darling recruiter of women into extremism. How is the FBI have a section, a separate section, or knowing that this is a particular issue that it must deal with?
So really quickly, so foreign fighter is a problem, but it's a small problem compared to our European partners. The larger problem is that population of HVEs, inspired, those individuals who are frustrated travelers, denied travelers, don't have the means to travel. Foreign fighters small, the larger population, the larger concern is much larger. ISIL and others are looking to recruit that part. They know they can't travel, so what they're doing is they're putting out a very effective propaganda message through social media, through lots of platforms, saying, hey, if you can't come to Syria, do something in the U.S. or in Western countries. That social media outreach is focused on those who use social media, our youth. So you find the trend over the last year or so has been a decreasing age group that are being recruited, both male and female, as well as you're seeing more females, younger females, attracted to this message.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Steinbach, let me begin by commending you and the FBI for your work in apprehending that 20-year-old radicalized individual who intended to attack the Capitol building across the street. This was sort of near and dear to me because he was from my district, went to a local high school there, and the mosque that he allegedly attended is about a quarter of a mile from the place I had my first job, and is 2 miles from the home that I've lived in for 30 years and lived in that within 2 miles for 50 years now. So this is right in the heart of where we come from. And now, my first question was, he claimed to have attended that mosque, and it is relatively close to where he would have grown up, et cetera. On the coverage back home on television, the people from the mosque that were on TV that were asked about him said, well, we never saw him, we don't know anything about him. Is that something that has been looked into up to this point? Do we know if he was connected to that mosque or not?
Let me be careful about talking about an ongoing investigation, but I will say that, yes, we have a strong understanding with our local partners there, state and locals, as to how his radicalization beginnings, what his intent was. So we're pretty comfortable understanding that individual.
And that it was or wasn't connected to that mosque?
So again, I don't want to get into the specifics of the investigation. I would say, to back it up in general and to talk about HVEs in general, I would say the majority of the radicalization process now, though varied as it is, we're finding the majority is online and in the internet.
Right, and clearly it looked that the majority of where the input came and the motivation was online, and as you indicated, that seems to be happening more and more frequently. Sheriff Stanek, let me ask you, I also want to commend you for your work in reaching out to the Somali community in your area and forging the strong bonds between law enforcement and the Somali diaspora, and the work you're doing to continue your hiring efforts in order to create a more diverse agency and those types of things. Let me ask you about, there's been some controversy about a spokeswoman at the State Department who's made some interesting proposition about, if we need to find more jobs for these folks, and if we can do that, then they won't end up killing us, for lack of a better term. That we have to, her quote exactly was, we need to go after the root causes that lead people to join these groups, whether it's lack of opportunity for jobs or whatever. We can help them build their economies so they can have job opportunities for these people. With an unemployment rate of 3.6, which is 2% under the national average in Minnesota, and congratulations on that. Do you believe that if we had created more jobs for the dozens of young men who were radicalized by al-Shabaab and became suicide bombers in Somalia, that they would have chosen a different path?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Congressman Shabbat, thank you very much for that question. I think that's only one part of the equation. I think that is not the only way that these individuals thrive and grow in our community. Minnesota prides itself on a very diverse community. Many of us in Minnesota are immigrants. I come from Polish heritage, second generation, a lot of folks. But education, jobs, the economy, only one part of it. The other part is also understanding the American criminal justice system, understanding our culture, and for us to understand what they bring to the table. We have worked extremely hard on this. It is not easy. It is about those long-term trusting relationships that we're working every day to build.
Okay, thank you. And just to follow up, and I'm almost out of time here, as chairman now of the Small Business Committee and having served on that committee and this one for 19 years now, I mean, I'm all for job creation and getting this economy moving, and we can do that by lessening the regulations on small businesses, reforming the tax code, and a whole range of things. But anybody that thinks that a job program is going to go a long way towards solving our problem with these radicalized folks in this country or over there, I think that's not a very correct way of thinking about this. I mean, these people are deadly serious. They have a job, and that's beheading people and torturing people, and it's their mentality is convert or die, and we got to defeat them. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend the testimony we've heard here today from these gentlemen, and it's to me very important that I compliment Sheriff Stanek because you anticipated the very set of questions I was going to put to someone that's right there on the ground as to how do you interact and relate to people of a different faith, many of whom are very nervous about elected officials and law enforcement officials particularly, and your strategies that you've discussed here today and the interaction that you've made not only with the community but with the leaders of their community are extremely critical. And I think it's a step-by-step instruction manual for local law enforcement officials everywhere in this country to follow. Are there any considerations about this part of our discussion here today that you'd like to add to?
Mr. Chairman and Congressman Conyers, you are absolutely correct, and thank you very much. The men and women who work in my sheriff's office, as well as my partner law enforcement agencies in Minnesota, really appreciate that. In fact, as you know, Minnesota, the Minneapolis area, was selected as one of the 3 pilot cities across the U.S., Boston, Los Angeles, and Minneapolis, to share what we've learned. Unfortunately, we learned as a result of some tragic incidents with Douglas McCain and Sherwa Ahmed, but we fully intend on helping our local law enforcement partners understand what we can do. Race, ethnicity, gender have no place in terms of policing. We treat everybody equally, and like I said, we not only respect, we protect the civil rights and liberties.
Well, that's what I think we need to get out, because there is an understandable dichotomy between people and of different faiths and religions relating to law enforcement and elected officials, and I think you've set the pace for how it ought to be done. And I hope that we can somehow incorporate your experiences into messages that we here in Washington, all the members of the federal legislature, get out to all of the people in our country. Director Steinbach, with respect to the threat posed by the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations, you state that the FBI, along with our local, state, and federal partners, is utilizing all investigative techniques and methods to combat the threat these individuals may pose to the United States. Now, when you say federal partners, do you include the Department of Homeland Security?
Yes, sir.
Well, I noticed that in your testimony on February 11th before Homeland Security, you referred specifically and explicitly to that. Isn't that correct?
I'm going to leave it up to you to, I assume so, sir. I can't recall.
Well, I can help you. You did.
Okay.
But you didn't. But you didn't mention it today, and as you know, in very shortly, we're going to be out of funding for that. Do you have any recommendations or views about the funding of the Department of Homeland Security?
No, sir. I would stay. I would not comment on that.
How come?
Sir, I think it's a political question, and I'm going to stay out of that. My job as the Assistant Director of Counterterrorism is to lead the FBI efforts in counterterrorism.
Well, I tried.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Labrador.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank both of you for being here today. I want to thank you for your service and for the good work you're doing for the people of the United States and your communities. Mr. Steinbach, in your written testimony, you mentioned that ISIL's online program propaganda efforts as a threat to Western interests. How is the FBI approaching the spread of ISIL's online presence?
So I think it's not just the FBI, it's the whole of government, including state and local partners like the sheriff here. We have to approach it from a counter-messaging perspective, where we look to countering violent extremists efforts at the local level in particular, like the sheriff mentioned, a larger counter-messaging narrative. And then, of course, we have to look at, from an investigative point of view, from an intelligence collecting point of view, find out where they're at and be where they're at in social media and on the internet.
Excellent. Sheriff, what are you doing at the local level to counter especially the propaganda that's on the internet?
Sure. Well, Mr. Chairman and Congressman Labrador, you know, we try and change the narrative of this propaganda. Like I said, it's not the first time the Mall of America, an iconic institution, happened to be located in Minnesota, has been mentioned. We go to the community itself and help empower them. We look to the young people like the organization called Kajug, Muhammad Farah, and others who were out here last week with us, or Imam Robley and the religious leaders, or some of the business people like Mr. Behe and others who every day are out in the community. They are reflective of the community, and they work with local law enforcement to help change that narrative, help the young people understand. Talking with the moms, the Somali mothers of these young men and women who, for some reason, choose, like I said, to be radicalized, maybe go overseas, maybe act out here, but we work with them. It is not easy. Like I said, it's a long-term trust-in relationship. It's not just a conversation, it's a discussion where you come back to the table time and time and time again.
Thank you. Mr. Steinbach, we know that the problems you had in Brooklyn, that the persons who were arrested were not American citizens. They were legal permanent residents. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, are we finding that most of our problems are with non-citizens, with people that are here illegally, or are you finding more problems with actual young kids who were born in the United States?
So I think an interesting fact on some of the individuals that we investigate for support to ISIL is the lack of a singular profile. We find citizens, legal permanent resident aliens, some folks that are overstaying their visa. There's actually quite a diversity of those individuals who, for one reason or another, state an intent to harm the United States.
So, do you think this is a growing threat? Do you think the Brooklyn situation is representative of a growing threat in the United States?
I believe that it's a good example of what the threat looks like, which is individuals who perhaps began their intellectual curiosity looking online, at some point were either radicalized before, but became more radicalized online, focused their efforts to do something, to travel overseas. If they can't travel overseas, to conduct an attack in the U.S. We're seeing that play more and more often. So I would say it's probably a good cross-section of some of the cases we have.
Are you finding a growing threat also of people coming from Western Europe and other areas to the United States who have these radicalized ideas?
So I don't know if we have it's a growing threat. I don't think we see an uptick in Western Europeans coming to the United States to conduct an attack or do some type of operation. Again, it's a cross-section of individuals, those who have born and raised in the United States, those that are first-generation residents, legal permanent residents, those who have come in and overstayed their visa. It really is a lack of a profile on their status that is remarkable in this threat.
How do you think we can then combat that? Do you have any suggestions for us here in Congress about some things that we should be doing and thinking about?
If I were to comment on one area where I think we are most concerned about as an organization, as an intelligence community, it's on the idea of going dark, which I think I mentioned in my testimony. So there are essentially three paradigm shifts after 9/11: the internet, and this third paradigm shift being social media, and the ability of sympathizers, recruits to use social media effectively is a concern for us. And the concern is that with the number of social media companies with encryption, we are continuing to go dark, both as a law enforcement community, as an intelligence community. So I would ask Congress to look seriously towards updating CALEA and laws and legislation to allow us to lawfully intercept. When we've got the right through the FISC or through the criminal courts to intercept communication content, I would ask that we receive help from Congress to go down that road. It's a concern, and we continue to lose more and more ability to see the content lawfully.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu.
Sheriff Stanek, the Countering Violent Extremism program is designed in part to encourage individuals to provide law enforcement with information deemed suspicious or predictive of violent extremism. I have heard from the Muslim American community who have concerns that the program is largely focused on them and that it can be stigmatizing and can lead to distrust between the American Muslim community and law enforcement. As someone who's worked directly on these issues, could you share your approach to building trust and ensuring that your community is safe while minorities are not isolated? And could you also describe law enforcement practices that have not worked in the past?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Congresswoman Chu, thank you very much for that question. You are correct. Countering violent extremism, CVE, is different than community engagement techniques, CET. And so we do not mix the two. You cannot, shall not mix the two. If members of the diaspora community think that your community engagement techniques are nothing more than a front for intelligence gathering to counter violent extremism, that is a problem. You get at countering violent extremism by building strong relationships in the community through community engagement techniques. And I want to be clear about that. Again, the strategy that local law enforcement uses is akin to community-oriented policing concepts like we use with gangs and other things as we have fought them across this country. And they are age-old, tried and true techniques and practices in which local law enforcement works every day with those communities to help them understand, and like I said earlier, to help empower them to do for themselves and be responsive to local law enforcement.
Thank you for that. And Director Steinbach, what steps is the FBI taking to ensure that the CVE programs do not stigmatize Islam or single out Muslim Americans?
I think the sheriff alluded to it best, ma'am. Community countering violent extremism is best left to the local level. I shouldn't be sitting here in D.C. dictating how Sheriff Stanek is going to involve his community in that outreach and in that program. We need to, at the federal government level, empower them, but push it down to the community level, which is why I think you saw last week Los Angeles, Boston and Minneapolis come and kind of lay out their models. I think each model has to be individually tailored based on the needs of the community, but I really think that CVE efforts need to be pushed out to the local level, much like DARE. Let the community, not only the police, but community centers, religious institutions, the schools, they have to be intimately involved. They're the best place to handle that.
Okay, thank you. Sheriff, 2 weeks ago in North Carolina, 3 young American Muslims were murdered execution style by a neighbor who, it is widely documented, expressed deep hatred of Muslims as well as other religions. As you might imagine, there are many people in this country who formed bigoted views of all Muslims as a result of ISIL. In fact, after 9/11, the number of anti-Muslim hate crimes increased nearly 500-fold. And in the years since, annual hate crimes have hovered in the 100 to 150 range, about 5 times higher than the pre-9/11 rate. What steps are being taken to ensure that hate crimes against American Muslims do not occur?
Yeah, we, Mr. Chair and Congresswoman, we work extensively with the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of Civil Rights and Liberties on reaching out to our Muslim community, helping them understand what their rights are, where the complaints. We just dealt with a mosque issue in one of our local communities. They wanted to build a mosque. That suburban community said no, for whatever reason it was. We followed up with the United States attorney. He was very bold. He was very straightforward. He sued that local community to help them have a better understanding, I think, of what it means for religious freedom and to be able to do what they want to do within the bounds of law. That mosque is now, the groundbreaking is next week. I will be attending proudly, representing local law enforcement. That's a great example of doing things the right way for the right reason and not discriminating.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back at this time. Chair yields to the gentleman from Texas, Judge Poe.
Appreciate the chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. As the chairman indicated, I used to be a criminal court judge in Texas and a prosecutor. I just give you that by way of background in the criminal justice area. 150 Americans have traveled abroad, recruited by ISIS. How were they recruited?
I'm sorry.
How were they recruited? The so-called 150 that have been radicalized and gone abroad, how were they recruited?
So not 150 have traveled abroad. That's our category. So that includes a bucket of those who've tried to travel, those who have been killed, those who have been arrested. But broadly, that 150-ish number, I'd say there's a variety of means. If I had to categorize one method over the other, I would say the internet or social media probably ranks highest, but it's also friends and associates. But I'd say the internet and social media probably is the overriding.
Would you agree with that, Sheriff?
You know, Mr. Chairman and Congressman, I do that, as well as, I think, extended families. A lot of the folks in my community, again, maybe we're just a little bit different because I've got that large Somali population, but a lot of them have extended family back in around the Horn of Africa.
I want to specifically talk about ISIS and other foreign terrorist organizations with that label that we give them, not a terrorist that somebody may just say, well, that's a terrorist out there in the fruited plain, but specifically foreign terrorist organizations and ISIS and their recruitment. The Section 219 of the Immigration Nationality Act states that it is unlawful to provide a designated foreign terrorist organization with material support or resources, including property, tangible or intangible, or services. I'm sure you've heard that and read that before. Twitter seems to be one of the avenues of social media where individuals are radicalized, or recruited through public Twitter sites. I'm not talking about the private chatter, I'm talking about the public. They use propaganda, recruitment, and they raise money on Twitter. Would both of you weigh in on the obligation of Twitter, if any, in your opinion, I'm asking your opinion, not a legal opinion, of being more proactive on taking down those sites? After all, you just said they've been recruited by social media, and that's just one of the many others. Facebook and YouTube seem to do a fairly good job of taking down those individual sites. Would both of you briefly weigh in on that issue?
Yes, sir. So we've engaged Twitter. We've spent lots of time discussing with Twitter our concerns, but I think we need to be careful that, because what we do see is, like you said, individuals engaging in the public arena on Twitter and other social media accounts, but then they do very quickly take their conversations into private chat. So on the public forums or in the public arena, we see just conversation, First Amendment conversations, if you would like. And so I would be hesitant to dictate to Twitter how to conduct its business. Now, we do have conversations with them, and when it's appropriate, we explain to them the threat, and we would hope that by the terms of their service agreement, they would then remove those posts. But for the most part, from my experience, what you see is individuals who quickly take the conversation offline to an end-to-end encryption device or some other means to really discuss plans and really discuss those things that we would use to charge somebody with material support.
Okay, I'm about out of time, so let me try to sum up just on this one issue. Foreign terrorist organizations, though, are not permitted, we're not permitted to help foreign terrorist organizations under the code that I just read you. We would never allow ISIS to take out an ad in the Washington Post recruiting folks to go to Syria, radicalize, and come back and kill us. We wouldn't allow that to occur. Why? Because that'd be aiding, but to me, that'd be violation of this statute. Statute does require, I'm not talking about where we can disagree whether or not they're recruiting. I'm talking about open, obvious site of recruitment. Does the FBI, on occasions, recommend that Twitter take down that specific site?
No, sir, we don't.
So you don't make that recommendation to Twitter?
No, what we do is if we see a site of interest, we provide them some type of process to start monitoring that site. Now, in many cases—
They monitor it or you monitor it?
We request through legal process or through 2702, we request that we get access to stored content, current content, and then in many cases what ends up happening is Twitter then voluntarily takes it down. But we don't specifically ask to take down a site.
Okay, so you don't make that request, you let them make that decision on their own. One more question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. The 3 individuals or 4 that were apparently arrested today, Coney Island, through public news sources, it states that the information to find out who these individuals were was through confidential informants. I'm not asking you to comment on that. Confidential informants, as the term is used, is still one of the best ways, is it not, to find out who people are who are committing crimes, not just in terrorism, but any type of crimes in the community. Would you agree with that or not, either one of you?
Absolutely.
Sheriff.
Oh, yes, sir. We encourage it. Like you said, the See Something, Say Something campaign is akin to that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. We had a Homeland Security meeting going on at the same time, and I think that the protection of the homeland is very important to everybody, and it has a scattering today. Let me ask just a basic question, and Mr. Steinbach or Sheriff, you may have some insight. But as you all deal and interact with ISIL, ISIS, IS, however you want to call it, or the people involved in it, do you all have a sense of the end game or what they perceive to be the win? And I ask that question because it helps me to understand, how we deal with them in terms of homegrown terrorism and so forth. So, Mr. Steinbach, do you have a sense of that?
Yes, sir. I think ISIL's been pretty outspoken in its plan to reestablish the caliphate. And if you look at some of their open source information, the caliphate extends well past Syria and Iraq. It goes into northern Africa. It goes north. So I think that's their stated intent. And so when they look to recruit, they look to recruit lots of individuals, foreign fighters, professionals, to come to the caliphate to help establish that caliphate. And if you can't come to the caliphate, attack the West.
Mr. Chairman and Congressman Richmond, I absolutely concur. I think that is, that is the answer. That is what they seek from us or to do to us.
And I guess in some of my reading, and I guess I was looking for the ultimate win, and I don't know if it's the plan for the apocalypse or the end of the world or whatever, but part of that becomes then what message are they using in terms of social media to people in the United States to get them excited about getting involved in this, or is it true just a push on the religion?
Well, I think they have a very effective message. So, perhaps previous groups like Al-Qaeda identified the caliphate in years or decades to come.
Right.
ISIL has said the caliphate is now. Bring your family to the Islamic State now. And that's a fundamental difference. So it's a message that is resonating with a lot of individuals. And then when you get online to some of these places, they describe a community, which is a false narrative, of course, but they describe a community with schools and infrastructure and support services that I think younger and younger folks find attractive. And again, I will emphasize that's a false narrative.
And I think that's consistent with everything that I've read, that they push that there's free health care, there's free schooling, and that your food and everything will be provided for you, but if you still want to work and do exceedingly well, you can. And I think that, to the extent we can, and to what extent have we made sure that we get the information out there that this is not true, that it's all propaganda intended to suck you into the cause and to get you involved, but it absolutely is not true. And I have not seen that message out there as much as I've seen the opposite message.
So I think you're right, sir. We have an effective counter narrative, but the volume, the sheer volume, we are losing the battle to. The amount of use of social media and other internet-based activities eclipses our effort.
Mr. Chairman and Congressman, I think you're absolutely right, though. That counter-narrative is really important, and that's what we do when we counter violent extremism in our local community, when we reach out and work with the diaspora community. They do it for us. We empower them. Like I said, on Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening, after this video comes out about Mall of America and ISIL, the community itself responds. They didn't do that years ago. We've empowered them to be able to do that and work with them.
Which is a great, I guess, probably last question, is how do we, as a Congress and as a government, empower them and include them more in helping us to fight something where we're at an inherent disadvantage as a government, as a traditional FBI or law enforcement, where minorities are so underrepresented? How do we expand the umbrella to help empower those communities and that faith religion to help us with this, because they share our same interest and they want our same result, which is to defeat ISIL. So how do we include them? And Mr. Chairman, after that answer, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, can I answer that question?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Both of you, if you wish, may answer the question. Sure.
Congressman, I think you are absolutely right again. But, should this committee ever choose to get out of D.C. instead of your home districts, come visit me in Minnesota. I'd be happy to sit down with you at the Safari Restaurant on 31st and 4th Avenue South in the heart of the Somali community. Meet Abdi Warsami, a Minneapolis elected city council member. Meet a member of the Minnesota legislature, the first one elected in this country. Meet the school board members who are Somali Americans. Understand that they are working really hard, and now they have moved on, and now they're representing their community in the very venues like we do, like you do. I think that is really important. And I encourage you, if you ever get a chance, call me. I'd be happy to sit down and have a meal with you at the Safari Restaurant or somewhere else.
And I certainly couldn't top that. I think the sheriff's right. I mean, it's his efforts and the efforts of police officials and sheriffs around the country that need to be leading the way in this counter-messaging effort. They know their communities much better than I do, and I wouldn't pretend to take lead in that. I expect and it's happy to see individuals like the sheriff take lead in that and make effective use of that outreach.
All right, thank you. Gentleman's time has now expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bishop, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank both of you for being here today. It's refreshing to see the collaboration that goes on between local and federal departments. I'm from the Detroit area, Oakland County, Michigan, home of Mike Bouchard, who is our sheriff, and has done a similar job in establishing a relationship with the federal agencies in the Detroit area. And I'm grateful for that because they're building the same kind of relationships. I was just briefed by the FBI in Detroit, and they're doing a fantastic job in an area. We're a border community. We're a number of races, religions. It's a melting pot in our community. So it's a full-time job in building relationships, and law enforcement has done a great job. I mention that because ISIL controls a large swath of territory in eastern Syria and northern Iraq. And there are 7 nations that border Iraq and Syria, including Iran and Lebanon. And near as I can figure, that's 7 different exit points and entry points. And I'm wondering if you can comment, I guess specifically to the director, do you have relationships with these foreign nations, the same as you have with your local law enforcement, that help coordinate your efforts?
So I wouldn't say just the FBI alone. The intelligence community, the U.S. government, has robust relationships with neighboring countries, Western allies, and that relationship has become all the more important as the world has shrunk, and the speed with which information must be shared is needed. So yes.
Thank you. I want to go back to this this going dark issue that you raised earlier. I didn't think you got enough time to expound upon that. As a former prosecutor myself, I understand the importance of information and having the opportunity to gain access to certain information. But I also understand the civil libertarians out there are concerned about how that information is accessed and the process by which you are to access it. And we hear a lot of talk about Section 2702 and all this legalism, all these legalisms that are out there. But can you explain to folks, generally speaking, how you obtain this information and the fact that you just don't have open access to that information?
Yes, sir. Be happy to. So I think it's important to note what we're talking about is not obtaining additional authorities, expanding authorities, but being able to use those existing authorities we have. So with the telecommunication and social media companies, the internet companies, as they've increased their technology, we don't have the ability to go in with the same legal authorities we've always had to obtain content, whether that's a criminal investigation for child pedophiles or gangs or organized crime or terrorism. We're talking about going with a lawful court order. On the national security side of the house, that would be the FISC, or we're talking about on the criminal side through the courts, with a court order signed by a magistrate that would allow us lawfully to see that content. So we're not talking about looking and obtaining additional authorities or expanding our reach. We're talking about that same ability we've always had. And I will say that we're losing that ability. If you look at the numbers, and in a classified setting we can talk more, but we are getting further and further away from that ability, that lawful ability that we're asking for.
Well, tell me, just so that the public understands, what threshold do you have to show to gain access, to get that court order, for example, to do what you need to do?
So we have to go to a court, either the FISC or to a magistrate in the criminal courts, or at the state level or at the federal level, and show cause, so probable cause as to why, provide an affidavit that lays out the facts, that shows why we believe it's important and necessary towards the investigation to look at that, either that stored content in a search or look at the ongoing content.
And a warrant is not issued unless there is an established probable cause based on the evidence you presented and the testimony you presented, correct?
Correct.
Very quickly, there are 3 amendments to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which will be expiring on June 1, 2015, including Section 206 and 215 of the USA Patriot Act. Can you tell me how the expiration of these authorities would impact the FBI's ability to conduct investigations?
I think it would have a negative implication. We use those tools responsibly, but we use them to identify those individuals that have stated an intent to conduct a terrorist attack or support a foreign terrorist organization. And if those tools, those lawful tools, expire, it'll limit our ability to do our jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. This time, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Appreciate you being here, your testimony. I'm still confused after these years over communication problems within our Homeland Security. I wasn't here when Homeland Security Department was created, but since I've been here at times, it seems like it's created more bureaucracy to get through in trying to get messages to and from the different departments that are affected. I was curious, I'd seen an article today in Breitbart that about U.S. Customs and Border Protection and special agents with U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security Investigations got a tip about a large shipment of marijuana. It's resulted in finding a tunnel in a home in Arizona, and it had a hydraulic lift coming up from the tunnel. They're saying 4,700 pounds of marijuana were found. And I am curious, the article indicates that that a significant number of the finds of tunnels don't come from detecting the tunnels. Mr. Steinbeck, are you familiar with efforts to try to locate tunnels that might be going across our border? I know it's normally affects more the DEA, but ever since I read the Tom Clancy novel, where, yeah, the drug tunnels ended up being hired out by cartels, actually to Middle Eastern terrorists. I've wondered if that isn't a possibility, if some of our enemies are as smart as Tom Clancy was. Are you consulted? Does Counterterrorism Division look at those issues at all?
We do, sir, and I think you break it down between known threats and vulnerabilities. So the southwest border would certainly be a vulnerability. So part of our job is working with the rest of the intelligence community, again, with the locals in that area to discuss and research what potential vulnerabilities are out there that not only would be used by a drug cartel, but it could also be exploited by a foreign terrorist organization. So we have a process. We work with our partners through the JTTFs, through the fusion centers, to make sure that stuff like that, information like that, is spread horizontally across the infrastructure so that my folks in counterterrorism with a counterterrorism slant can look at it. The sheriff's folks can take a look at it from local law enforcement. It's really the key is having an infrastructure set up so that the fusion centers, the JTTFs, have a robust information sharing process so that when stuff pops up across the spectrum of the 17,000 state, local, and tribal agencies, that it's quickly pushed where it needs to go.
Well, you bring up the fusion centers. I'd heard from some of our law enforcement that, gee, it's now become a one-way street. The feds want us to give them our information, but we can't get information back from them. Sheriff, how has your communication been in the last few months with the fusion center? Have you had any success in getting information from the federal authorities?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, you raise a good point as well. Some of that relies on individual states and your criminal intelligence sharing laws. Like in my state, I am not allowed to share that information between federal and local law enforcement. In many other states, it's some patchwork of local state laws. However, we have a good relationship with our Fusion Center. Just on Sunday afternoon, we received a joint information bulletin from the FBI, from the Department of Homeland Security, talking about the Mall of America and this video that I referenced earlier. That's information we need. It was timely, it was accurate, it was to the point, and it helped us prepare, or better prepare.
All right. Well, and actually, you bring up, Mr. Steinbeck, the issue of vulnerabilities. I'd seen an article February 14th, again, Breitbart reported that the Border Patrol agents catch Middle Eastern man sneaking into Texas, and that's the most I'd seen reported, but my sources indicate that actually he was from Iraq, he spoke fluent Russian, and that supposedly all he would say about his occupation is that he trained people. Does your counterterrorism division get word when people like that from countries where there is radical Islamic play, do you get word when those type of situations arise? Do you get a chance to question someone like that?
Yes, sir. So I would say, going back to the Fusion Center piece, just to kind of show that tight, we have over 100 agents and analysts sitting in Fusion Centers. We've got 57 of our Fusion Centers have access to FBI databases sitting there. That information starts generically at the local level and is pushed to us. So in the case of the gentleman you're talking about, that would be classified as a special interest alien. Those individuals coming from countries of concern that need greater scrutiny to look towards, you know, what are their true motivations and intentions for trying to sneak across the border.
Okay. Did you know about this particular Iraqi individual that trains people that speaks Russian?
I myself did not personally know.
Okay. All right. Well, yes.
May I have just
Yield to the gentlelady from Texas. Sure. You and I are the only ones left, so certainly I doubt that since I would object that there is any other objection. So unanimous consent, you may.
The gentleman is very kind. First, my appreciation to the chairman for his steady line of questioning. We've worked together on a number of issues. And then my appreciation, Mr. Chairman, I think you were here when I noted that Sheriff Stanek was here last week and was quick to accept our response or our invitation to come back again to Washington. We know we might love it, and I'm smiling with that, but we know that our visitors have work at home, and we appreciate that. We thank Mr. Steinbeck for his years of service. So let me just have these quick questions. I asked a question about women and the increasing recruitment of women and their adherence to extremism, which was made a very big point in our meetings last week. So I want to make sure that there is a different approach to how men are recruited and sometimes a different approach to women, even though the attractiveness is empowerment, excitement. Have you begun to look at that distinctiveness of the recruitment of women? Sheriff Stanek.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Congresswoman, we have. In fact, I've had several conversations with a young Somali woman in Minnesota, very active, named Fartoon Welly, who serves on the Sheriff's Community Advisory Board. She's very engaged with the community. In addition, we meet roundtable of Somali women. Like I said, many of them are moms, and they understand what's happening with their young people and what's driving and motivating them. They are the key, at the end of the day, to a lot of our outreach efforts with the community itself.
So I will finish with Mr. Steinbeck, but my final question to you is, you've been in law enforcement for 32 years, and you were obviously serving during the heinous acts of 9/11. Do you feel that we are better communicators and exchangers of information and intelligence today between local and state and federal than we were pre-9/11 or 9/11? Sheriff?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Congresswoman, I absolutely do. You know, there was a time when we would have been at opposite ends of this table. Not anymore. Federal law enforcement agencies like the FBI and DHS are full partners with local law enforcement. I represent the nation's sheriffs. I was impressed that the congressman knew Sheriff Bouchard, who's my mentor, Sheriff Garcia from your county, and many of the others who serve here. We do it for the right reason every day, but we work hand in hand with our federal partners. We may be the boots on the ground, but we cannot do it alone. We need what they have, and they've been very willing, whether it's Director Mueller or Director Comey, to come to the table and provide that to us. Thank you.
Ms. Steinbach, I'll finish with the courtesies of the chairman. First of all, to thank you very much, Sheriff. First of all, to say that I would hope that if Congress gives federal law enforcement more tools, such as, for example, a thorough watch list and the no-fly list that we seek to make sure that it is thorough, that would be a helpful tool, even as it may be a large number or small number, but always to be accurate is a helpful tool. Is that not correct, Mr. Steinbach?
Yes, ma'am, of course. I think the more tools you can provide us, the better we're able to do our job. When you consider the evolving threat and the changing nature, I think the more tools are more important for us.
I appreciate that. Then I just ask you the simple question. I think you were certainly serving this country pre-9/11, and now you're continuing to serve the country. Would you say that the communication between all levels of law enforcement around this rising and increasing threat of terrorism is much better than it was when we couldn't follow the dots of a memo on a desk in, I believe it was Minneapolis, that did not connect the dots of individuals learning to take off and not land? Are we at a better point?
Yeah, I would say we were absolutely in a better place. And I'll give you an example from my perspective is I don't have responsibility necessarily for Minneapolis or Minnesota, yet I have met Sheriff Stanek on numerous occasions. We are not strangers. This is not the first time we've met. I've been at the major county sheriffs and major city chiefs. We've had interactions, and we have a very robust relationship. I think the JTTF process is the right balance of pushing, and we've learned as we've gone. Certainly, we made mistakes, but we continue to improve. I would say our information sharing process is better than it's ever been, and I would challenge us that we need to continue to not only share, but share real time at the speed of light, because that's how quickly the information has to get passed.
My last point, would you reaffirm that the outreach tactics, relationships with these unique communities, in this instance the Somalian community, but there is the large populations in places like Michigan and elsewhere, Texas, is important, and are you tuned in to the new element of extremism among women, particularly women that can be attracted to the fight?
Yes, ma'am. That tool is
with
invaluable.
ISIL. Pardon me?
That tool is invaluable. You know, when you look at radicalization, it's a spectrum. It starts with somebody with an intellectual curiosity, and it drives to a point where they've developed an intent where enforcement disruption is necessary. But before you get to the point where law enforcement action is necessary through prosecution, through deportation, there's a whole piece to that at the local level that the sheriff's involved in trying to change that intellectual curiosity and change the course of that individual.
And women extremism?
Women extremism, it's a new phenomenon, and ISIL has taken advantage of it. They still are a minority, but they're a much larger minority than they were 2-3 years ago, and so it's a new concern for us.
Mr. Chairman, you've been very kind. I want to thank the Judiciary Committee, and particularly this subcommittee, for recognizing its duty and responsibility. And the issue of extremism among young women is an issue of concern to me, and I hope that this subcommittee and the full committee can look collaboratively on this unique but growing phenomenon that has a major, or has a capacity to expand and become extremely dangerous. So I thank the gentleman for his kindness. I yield back my time.
Thank the gentlelady. Issue of communications was touched on eloquently, which brings to mind another couple of questions I wanted to ask Mr. Steinbach. Previously, numerous times we've had Secretary of Homeland Security here, and I have seen emails discussing, and they were not classified, discussing Secretary Napolitano's hands-off list in reference to someone with known terrorist ties, and that this individual, it turns out, the man with known terrorist ties, foreigner, was on the Secretary's personal hands-off list. Is your division ever consulted over people that I don't know if our new Secretary Johnson has a hands-off list or not, like apparently Secretary Napolitano did, but is your division ever consulted on people that may be put on a hands-off list by Homeland Security?
So I'm not aware of any hands-off list. I will say that we follow the intelligence, we follow the evidence. So if we identify information that suggests somebody is a member of, supporting a foreign terrorist organization, is radicalizing, we open a predicated investigation. That's an apolitical move, and we follow the intelligence to its logical conclusion. If that person is supporting a foreign terrorist organization, our job and our goal and our mission is to disrupt.
Well, if someone is a member, an associate of known terrorists, a member of a terrorist organization, I would hope that your division would take notice of that. We had Secretary Napolitano testifying, and I asked her about a man, a foreigner with known terrorist ties, member of a foreign terrorist group, being allowed to visit the White House, and she didn't know anything about it. She said, I can live with that as long as somebody in Homeland Security knows about it and has vetted the individual. And we had someone with those type ties that was cleared to visit the White House. Is the Counterterrorism Division ever consulted on people who may visit the White House who have ties to terrorist groups?
Anybody coming to the United States is subject to a vetting process. The Terror Screening Center, there's a multi-agency process that reviews databases to ensure that.
Are you talking about people coming legally into the United States?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Sir. Coming legally into the United States, there is a multi-agency vetting process that reviews to ensure that there are no ties that would suggest that make him or her a threat to the United States.
Okay, so from that, do you know if Counterterrorism Division was consulted before a member of a terrorist organization was allowed to visit the White House?
I don't know what incident you're talking about, sir, but I would say that the process isn't to contact counterterrorism, it's to contact the Terror Screening Center to go through the database checks. We review that.
And whose duty is it to notify you that such a person may be coming to the White House?
Any individual who comes to the United States is required to obtain a visa, some type of legal process to come to the United States. Once they go to the State Department for that legal process, it kicks in a number of checks that are automatic.
Okay, well now that raises a whole nother question, because I'd understood the FBI was, I believe it was first, the Russians notified the CIA that they had evidence or concerns that Tsarnaev had been radicalized, and when nothing was done, as far as they could tell, they notified the FBI that they had concerns Tsarnaev had been radicalized. Of course, I'm talking about the Boston bomber. Are you now saying that Counterterrorism Division would have been notified by either the CIA or the FBI that the Russians had concerns that Tsarnaev had been radicalized, or did you guys ever take a look at Tsarnaev before the Boston bombing?
So I think it's well known, sir, that we opened a Guardian based on information provided to us by that foreign government. At the end of the day, when we looked at the information, it didn't lead anywhere, and so the Guardian was closed.
Well, were you aware of what investigation the FBI did before you closed that?
Absolutely. There's a process before we close a...
Oh, I know. Director Mueller testified. They didn't go to the mosque to talk. They went to the mosque, but it was under their outreach program. They never went to the mosque that was started by convicted terrorist al-Moody to see if anybody there had any idea whether Tsarnaev had been radicalized. Was he reading Qutb? Was he reading things that had been known to radicalize others? Nobody asked those questions at the mosque he was attending, and from what we can tell, the best we got from the FBI, they talked to the bomber and talked to his mother, but I never was able to get any other information that anybody else was really talked to thoroughly. They talked to him, talked to his mom. They say they're not they're not terrorists. They go to the mosque in the outreach program, never ask about, are there any terrorist-type comments, radicalized comments? Has he read milestones like Osama bin Laden and is now thinking more radical? Apparently, nobody asked those questions. So I'm really sorry, but it doesn't give me comfort that you would have opened a file and closed it based on the testimony we've had from other individuals of how little they did to stop the Boston bombing. But we appreciate it, and the record will be open for a period of, here we are. All members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. And in fairness to both of you, if you think of something you would like to be part of the record, you would like for the committee to know, then please provide that within 5 days, and we'll include that as part of the record as well.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I just want to acknowledge that I have a group of members who are former retired law enforcement, the National Coalition of Law Enforcement Officers for Justice and Reform Accountability, who are in the audience. I just want to acknowledge them, Cleo, and thank them for their presence here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I know we both share not only appreciate their presence, but thank them for what they do day in, day out. So thank you for being here. Hearing nothing further, this hearing is adjourned.